In this lesson, we are going to learn how to work with Spring Boot microservices with Docker Compose. Here, we will create and run two Spring Boot microservices locally from Eclipse, then run those on Docker using Docker Compose, and finally, we will debug them on Docker using Eclipse. Now, in order to create and run the two microservices from Eclipse, I have the code in GitHub. I will download that in my local system and set it up using Eclipse. So the first step would be code download and project setup. Then using Maven, I have to clean and install them. And finally, I can run. So this is the local run. Following up, same process. What we need to do, we need to have Docker. And from there, using Docker Compose, we would build the image. And finally, Docker Compose up, we would be using to run those. At a high level, this is the structure I have. I have demo microservice 1, demo microservice 2. From browser, the request would be sent to demo microservice 1. From demo microservice 1, I would be invoking demo microservice 2. It would be sending a response back to the microservice 1. And microservice 1 in turn would send the request back to the browser. Now, before we move ahead, I want to suggest you one thing. This particular lesson is the very beginning of a series. I have future plans to create multiple lessons. Right now, I am creating the video on Docker Compose debug. It would be followed with Kubernetes debug locally. Then we would learn to debug in the remote Kubernetes clusters in different clouds like AWS, Azure, GKE, etc. So it is going to be a series going forward. I would suggest you, in case you like this particular lesson, you can subscribe to this channel so that when I publish those videos, you would be able to get the notification. Let us move ahead. Let me first set up the project in Eclipse and understand the project structure. In order to download the project, you need to go to github.com/j2expert2015 multiple Spring Boot microservices. Here you can click on this particular code button and copy the project URL and go to Eclipse. In Eclipse, you can click on File, Import, and you type Git, projects from Git, next, clone URI, next. Here I have the URL copied, so all these are populated. In your case, you need to provide your own credentials. Click next. Let me deselect all. I will only take the master branch. Click next again. Here it's showing a particular location. I want to place my project in a separate location. I have changed the location here. Click on next. Next again. Click finish. Now this is a project which has two Maven projects inside it. So it's not a multi-module application. Here I have two Maven projects, demo microservice 1, demo microservice 2, and they have their pom.xml. So directly this two I won't be able to run from here. What I need to do, I need to import these two projects separately so that I can run them. For that, go to File, Import, type Maven, select existing Maven projects, and go to the location where these directories are present. Let me click on next. So this is the project directory. I'm just selecting this. It will identify both the pom.xmls. Click on select folder. As I told, both of these projects are identified by Eclipse or detected by Eclipse. Click on finish. Now you can see these two projects are shown here. These are the Maven projects which I can run. So if I go inside demo microservice 1, let me go to the navigator view. I prefer this one. Inside demo microservice 1, you can see I have this microservice 1.java. This is basically the Spring Boot application class. What it has, standard stuff inside the main method, Spring application run, and then a logger statement stating that Spring Boot microservice 1 started successfully. It has one controller method. If I go inside this, you can see over here, it starts with one app config. Let me go to this particular app config inside this config package. Now here, this app config has two attributes. One is service host, whose default value is localhost. Otherwise, it would look for parameter called demo-microservice2-host. Parameter meaning if you set it as a Windows variable, or if you are using Docker, in the Docker Compose you can set environment variables. If you are using Kubernetes, from there also you can do some parameter passing. So in case you are passing a parameter named demo-microservice2-host, then it will take that parameter value. Otherwise, by default, it would keep the value as a localhost. Similarly, there is another variable called service2port. Its value by default is 8082. In case demo-microservice2-port, that parameter is set and that parameter is passed, it would take that value. So by default, it would be 808. Now why we need this at all? Let me explain. If I go to microservice 1 controller, from here, I have two things. One is this app config, which we discussed, right? It is auto-wired. Then I have REST template. Then I have two set of methods. One is display default message. When the web service URL is hit, by default this method is called and it would just return a message hello world from microservice 1. But there is another method which is this one. If there is an URL which /call microservice 2, what it does, it is taking these values, host name and port, and finally forming a URL, and with the help of REST template, it is invoking that URL. So this URL is basically the URL of microservice 2. Finally, it is getting the response and sending back the response. Now, in this case, when I run this particular project in Eclipse without any complication, if I try to access the microservice 2, its host would be localhost. Its port would be 8082, because in that project also I have port set as 8082. But suppose I'm running this in Docker or I'm running this in Kubernetes, where the host name is defined, where the port is defined, then I have to change the code and accordingly I have to change this host name or port name, which I don't want to do. That is why I have kept the option over here is in case this parameters are set, this application will take that parameters value. Otherwise, it would have default value. Similarly, if I go to this microservice 2, here I have microservice 2. It has main method and simple logger statement. Spring Boot microservice 2 started successfully. Then there is a controller. If I expand this, this controller has default method which says hello world from microservice 2, and also this method test call, which actually I'm trying to call from microservice 1 controller. If you can see over here, it is calling this /test call, and here there is a simple message, hi external service. It's a response from microservice 2. And port wise, if I see inside resources, application properties, microservice 1 uses 8081 and microservice 2, it uses 8082. Now let me run these applications. I'm closing all, select the first project, right click, run as, Maven build, clean install, check skip test, apply, run, let it run. In the meantime, I'm selecting this second project, Maven build, clean install, skip test, apply, run. Now the microservice 1, its build is successful. From here I can see the log for microservice 2 also. Let me go there. For this one also the build is successful. Now we are ready to run the applications. So let me go to the microservice 1, select this microservice 1.java, right click, run as Java application. Similarly, what I can do, I can go to this microservice 2.java, right click, run as Java application. So both of them are starting. Let's wait for a while. So if I scroll to the right, I can see microservice 2 started successfully. If I switch to the log of microservice 1, let's scroll a bit. Yeah, microservice 1 is also started. Now if I go to the browser, I'm going to open the first microservice over here. So this is the first microservice. Let me run the second microservice. Here you can see the default message is coming, hello world from microservice 1, and the next one, similar URL, the port number would vary. Instead of 8081, it would be 8082. So both of the microservices are up and running. Now I want to invoke the microservice 2 from microservice 1. So if I go back to microservice 1 controller, this is the method I have to invoke, call microservice 2, then in turn it will call this particular microservice 2. So I'm copying this, going back to the browser, let me add it over here, press enter. Now you can see, hi external service, it's a response from microservice 2. So what we have done, we have created two Spring Boot microservices. We are able to run them from Eclipse and they are able to communicate between each other. Now I'm going to run them in Docker. So if I go to this project directory, let me stop all this. Let me minimize everything, scroll to the left. Let us see the Docker files. Both of the projects have Docker file, pretty standard stuff. If I open the Docker file for this microservice 1, I have tried to keep it as simple as possible. So first it is taking this OpenJDK 8, then from the Maven target folder, it is taking the jar, finally there is a cmd command. Similarly, in microservice 2, similar thing, instead of microservice 1, it is microservice 2.jar. Now, how these names are coming? If you go to the pom.xml, in the pom.xml, I have mentioned the final build name like that only. If I expand this, you can see in the build, the names are like that, microservice 1. Similarly, in microservice 2, it is like microservice 2. That is why these jars are created with that name. So these are the Docker files. Now I have the Docker Compose at one level up. So if I go here, these are my two projects, and in the same level I have the Docker Compose. This Docker Compose YML, I have two Docker Compose YMLs. One is for normal run and another is for debugging. So let me first go through the Docker Compose YML, the normal one, where I would just run it in Docker. You can see in the services section, I have demo microservice 1 and demo microservice 2. In demo microservice 1, I am mentioning the image name with the repo name / the image name : the tag, which is latest. I am mentioning the container name as demo microservice 1, build context I have provided, Docker file I have mentioned. The port that it is going to use is 8081 mapped with 8081. And here, if you remember, I am passing environment variables. I am passing the host for the second microservice should be named like this. Why? Because the service name is here. In Docker, microservice 1 won't be able to connect to microservice 2 using localhost. It needs a name. That name I am passing here, and my application has the capability to pick up the host name dynamically. If something is passed as host name, it would pick up that. Otherwise, by default, it would take localhost. So when I'm running in Docker using Docker Compose, I'm passing the host name and it will pick up the host name accordingly. Same applies for port. Now, in the second microservice, it is similar. I have the image mentioned, the container name mentioned, the build context and Docker file that is also mentioned, and the port it is using 8082 mapped to 8082. Now, as both the images would require the jar file is already created because we did the maven clean install. It's already there. Now we need to build the images and run them in Docker container. So for that, in the project itself, if you see over here, I have mentioned all the commands. So I'm going to use them. So let me go to the command prompt. I want to go to this location. So properties, let me copy this path. So right now I'm in that project directory. So I'm going to run the command to create the image. Let's go to Eclipse and set this. So this is my command, docker build -t, the image name with the repo name and the tag. At the end, I have dot. Anyways, let me go to the console. But before that, I need to move to the microservice directory. Demo microservice 1, run the command. Okay, the first image is created, cd ... move one level up. Now move to the second microservice directory. Instead of 1, it should be 2. Go back to Eclipse, copy this command, Ctrl V. So here the second image is getting created. Fine. Let me clear the console. Okay, move one level up. Now here at this level, I have the Docker Compose. So what I can do a Docker Compose build, but that won't be necessary because I did it separately inside the project directory. So if you want to skip this image creation individually, what you can do, you can just do Docker Compose build. So here, if I go to the Eclipse, you have this particular command, Docker Compose build. Anyways, let me just run that. Now we need to run Docker Compose up instead of build, should be up. So I'm not running in a detached mode so that I can see the console directly from here. Now the images would be up, the containers would be created. It is telling both of the containers are created. Let me go to my Docker. If I go to containers section, okay, I think it's still in progress. Okay, so if I expand this, these are my microservices. It is already showing the URLs. Anyways, I have to check in the log what is coming. The applications are still starting, so the log is coming from both microservice 1 and microservice 2. It has started microservice 1. Now it has started microservice 2 also. Let me go to the browser and I can just select this one. It would prove both whether microservice 1 is up and 2 is also up or not. Now I see the response. Let me check the logs. So in the log, you can see the response received from microservice 2. So both of them are up and running. So we have run the microservices locally from Eclipse. We have run them in Docker successfully also using Docker Compose. Now comes the interesting part, debugging. If I go back to Eclipse, let me close everything. You can see I have this Docker Compose debug YAML file. Now, apart from the Docker Compose file, what is different over here? You can see there is a separate port that is mapped 5005, the debug port for microservice 1, and here 5006, the debug port for microservice 2. Apart from that, in the environment section, I have this Java tool options, agent lib, JDWP equal to transport, DT socket, server equals to Y, suspend equals to n, address equal to 5005. So the debugging related parameter I am putting inside the Docker Compose debug YML, so that when the application is started, it is started in debug mode pointing to this port 5005. Now for the second microservice, it is similar, but the port number is different. So you can notice one difference over here. Like all this Java tool options, the debugging related thing, we don't need to put into the individual Docker files. We can do that here inside the Docker Compose itself. And one important thing, as the image that we are using, that is JDK 8, so the syntax here is address equal to 5005. If it was JDK 9 onwards, it would have been address equal to *:5005. So this is one thing you have to keep in mind. The syntax is a little bit different in case of JDK 8 and the upward versions. Otherwise, you may face some problem while you work with Docker. So keep this in mind. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop everything. Let me go here, Control C. Now I'm going to build the images using the Docker Compose debug YML. So let me type Docker Compose -f, meaning the file. Here I am using the Docker Compose debug YML. I'm using the build over here. So the images that would be built now would be having those debugging related configurations, those port mappings. It is done. Now I'm going to run this. Here also I have to mention the file Docker Compose -f Docker Compose debug YML up, so that it does not use the default Docker Compose file. Otherwise there would be confusion. Both of the containers are getting recreated. You can see picked up Java tool options, agent lib. So it has picked up the configuration properties that we have given. The services would be up after a while. Now microservice 1 is up and running. Let's wait for microservice 2. Okay, now microservice 2 started successfully, as well as microservice 1. I'm going back to the browser. If I hit this particular URL, it will prove both, means microservice 1 is up, and also if it gets response from microservice 2, that indirectly proves microservice 2 is also up and running. So click on refresh. I have got the response. Let me check the logs. Yes, I can see the response received from microservice 2 equal to this. Now how to debug? Go back to Eclipse, close all this, go to microservice 1. Now select this microservice 1, right click, debug as Java configuration. Here you have this Java applications, but this would be remote debug. So you select this remote Java application, new configuration. So this is my microservice 1. I would rename it as -debug or -remote debug. The project is demo microservice 1. The port would be different, 5005. Let me click on apply and then click on debug. Now I need to debug this, so let me go to the controller and place some breakpoints wherever applicable. Say this is one method, I can just check. So placed one breakpoint over here and maybe another breakpoint over in this method. So let me go back to the browser, click on refresh. Now this icon is blinking. So the breakpoint is hit. You can see the breakpoint is hit. Let me switch to the debug mode. So now the debugging is working. Similarly, you can debug the microservice 2 also. Anyways, so here, as this is stuck over here, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to send the same response. I'm going to change the response a little bit. So this response, if I see over here, let me drag it a little bit. I'm going to change its value. Say something 1111 or whatever. Press enter. Now I'm going to click on this resume so that the flow is not halted. Now if you go back to the browser, you would be able to see that our change has gone here. So we are able to successfully debug the microservice in Docker using Eclipse. Now same way you can debug the microservice 2 also. If I go back to the project view, let me minimize this. Microservice 2, right click, debug as debug configuration. Now here I have microservice 2. So I need something similar. I can create one duplicate. What I can do, microservice 2 remote debug, change the project, select microservice 2. and here the port would be different. It would be 5006. Apply, debug, and let me go to the controller. I can select any of this method. Let me select the first one, and if I go to the browser, this is the one. Let me refresh this. You can see the breakpoint is hit. So in this way, what we have done, we have run two Spring Boot microservices, first locally from Eclipse, then with the help of Docker files and Docker Compose, we have run them in Docker. Third, the interesting part, we have debugged them inside Docker using Eclipse. So as I mentioned earlier, this is going to be the very first video of a particular series, and I have a plan based on the response I get to create an overall series where I would be debugging in local Kubernetes, remote Kubernetes, and different clouds like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, etc. So I would request all of you to subscribe to this particular channel so that in case you are interested, you would get the notifications. So that is all for now. Thanks all.